It all started on a quiet, cloudy afternoon. One of those days where everything felt ordinary, yet something big was about to happen. At least, that's how it seemed for Maria Thompson, a hardworking housekeeper who had spent most of her life cleaning up after families far wealthier than she could ever imagine. She never complained, never asked for much, and certainly never expected life to hand her anything beyond the long hours and tired feet she had grown used to. But fate had a different plan for her, one that would change everything in the most unexpected way. Maria had been working for the Lancaster family for nearly a year now. The estate was massive, a towering mansion sitting on acres of land, surrounded by high iron gates that kept out the rest of the world. It belonged to William Lancaster, a reclusive billionaire known for his cold, business-minded approach to life. He had built his empire from the ground up and had spent the past decades living in quiet luxury, disconnected from the world outside his estate. Maria had never even seen him up close. In fact, most of the staff whispered that Mr. Lancaster barely spoke to anyone unless absolutely necessary. He was old, frail, and preferred to spend his time locked away in his study, going through papers or staring out the window like he was waiting for something or someone. Maria never thought much about it. Her job was simple: clean the rooms, keep everything spotless, and stay out of trouble. That was how she had lived her whole life. By the rules, by the book, never stepping out of line. But one evening, as she dusted the old bookshelf in their study, she accidentally knocked over a stack of papers. They scattered across the floor, some slipping under the heavy wooden desk. She knelt down, reaching to gather them, when her eyes landed on an old photograph, yellowed at the edges. It was a family portrait. A younger William Lancaster stood in the middle, his sharp eyes staring at the camera with pride. Beside him was a woman, elegant and graceful, and in her arms, a baby. But it wasn't the photo itself that made Maria freeze. It was the woman's face. Something about her seemed familiar, unsettlingly familiar. Her heart pounded as she studied the picture, a strange feeling creeping into her chest. It was like looking into a mirror of the past. Find something interesting. The deep, raspy voice made Maria jump. She turned quickly to see Mr. Lancaster standing behind her, his piercing blue eyes locked onto her. She scrambled to her feet, gripping the photograph like a guilty child caught red-handed. I'm sorry, sir," she stammered, trying to hand it back. "I didn't mean to." But he didn't take it. Instead, he stared at her, his expression unreadable. And then, in the strangest moment Maria had ever experienced, his face changed. His cold, distant demeanor cracked, replaced by something softer, something like recognition. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Maria frowned, confused by the question. I'm Maria, sir, your housekeeper." He shook his head, stepping closer. "No. Who are you really?" The air in the room felt heavy. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Maria didn't understand. What was he talking about? What did he see when he looked at her? And why, for the first time in her entire life, did she feel like she was standing on the edge of something much bigger than herself? Something was wrong, or maybe something was finally right, because in that moment, Maria had no idea that her entire life had been a lie. She had no idea that she wasn't just a housekeeper. She wasn't just another forgotten soul, working behind the scenes of the wealthy. She was about to uncover a truth so shocking, so life-altering, that it would shake everything she had ever known. She was the last living relative of a billionaire, and nothing would ever be the same again. Maria stood frozen, her heart pounding, so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Mr. Lancaster's gaze never wavered, his eyes scanning her face like he was searching for something. Confirmation, familiarity, proof of a truth he had just uncovered. But Maria, she had no idea what was happening. "Sir, I don't understand," she finally managed to say, gripping the photograph tightly in her trembling hands. "What do you mean? Who am I really?" The old man exhaled, his shoulders sinking like the weight of decades had suddenly crashed down on him. He didn't speak for a long moment, just staring at her with an intensity that made Maria's skin prickle. Then he reached for the photo and took it from her gently, his fingers tracing the edges of the faded image. "This woman," he said softly, pointing to the elegant lady in the picture. Her name was Eleanor Lancaster. "She was my daughter." Maria's breath caught in her throat. Daughter? She hadn't even known Mr. Lancaster had children. The staff never spoke of it, and as far as she knew, the only family he had was long gone. She opened her mouth to say something, but he continued. "Before she could form the words, she disappeared over 30 years ago," he murmured, his voice heavy with a pain that had never faded. "Ran away without a word. I spent years trying to find her, but it was like she vanished into thin air." Maria listened, her chest tightening. There was something in his tone, a deep sorrow, a loss that had hollowed him out. "She was pregnant when she left," he added, his eyes locking onto Maria's. "And now, you show up, looking exactly like her." Maria's stomach twisted. Her? The child of a missing heiress? No, it wasn't possible. She shook her head, stepping back. "There has to be a mistake," she whispered. "I grew up in foster care. I never knew my parents. I was just left behind." But even as she spoke, doubt crept into her mind. She had always wondered where she came from, why there were no records of her birth, why her features never quite matched anyone she met. And now, standing in front of this man, hearing these words, a terrifying thought crawled its way into her heart. What if he was right? Mr. Lancaster reached for a small wooden box on his desk. With shaky hands, he opened it and pulled out an old necklace, a delicate gold chain with a tiny charm, a rose, worn with time but still glistening. He held it out to her. Eleanor had this made, he said quietly. A custom piece. She told me she would give it to her child one day. Maria's fingers trembled as she took it, the weight of the pendant feeling heavier than it should. The moment it touched her palm, something stirred inside her, like a memory she couldn't quite grasp, something deep and buried. The world tilted slightly, her vision blurring at the edges. "No," she whispered, but her voice wavered. "You are my granddaughter," Mr. Lancaster said, his voice filled with certainty. "And you are the last living Lancaster." The words crashed into Maria like a tidal wave. Everything she knew, everything she believed about her life, was unraveling before her eyes. She felt dizzy, unsteady, as though the ground beneath her had shifted, leaving her without solid footing. And then came the real question, the one that chilled her to the bone. If she was truly his granddaughter, what had happened to her mother, Maria's? Mine raced. If Eleanor had left all those years ago, why had she never come back? Why had Maria been abandoned in foster care, growing up with nothing, no name, no family, no history? Something didn't add up, and the look in Mr. Lancaster's eyes told her that he had been wondering the same thing for a very long time. "I need to know the truth," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Lancaster nodded, his face shadowed with years of unanswered questions, and so the search began. Over the next few days, Maria and Mr. Lancaster dug into the past, old files, forgotten records, anything that could lead them to the truth about Eleanor. Maria barely slept, her mind spinning with endless possibilities. Was her mother still alive? If not, what had happened to her? And why had she never come back for her child? But the deeper they dug, the stranger things became. Documents had been erased. Hospital records were missing. There were no official reports of Eleanor giving birth, almost like someone had deliberately wiped her existence away. The few people who had known her either refused to talk or had conveniently forgotten. And then, Maria found something chilling in an old storage box in the mansion's attic. Buried beneath dust-covered files, she found a letter, an unsent letter addressed to William Lancaster. Dad, if you ever read this, it means I have failed. I am running because I have no choice, because they won't let me live if I stay, and they won't let my child live either. Please, if anything happens, find her. Keep her safe. They're watching me. They know everything. Maria's blood ran cold. Who were they? And why had her mother been so afraid? Before she could fully process it, a noise echoed from downstairs. A sharp sound, like a door slamming shut. Maria's head snapped up. Mr. Lancaster, who had been sitting across from her, tensed. They weren't expecting visitors. Then footsteps, heavy, purposeful. Maria's heart pounded. She could feel it, the air shifting, the presence of something, unseen, but dangerous. And in that moment, she realized, whoever had been watching her mother all those years ago hadn't stopped watching. Maria's breath hitched as the heavy footsteps grew closer. A cold fear curled in her stomach, but she forced herself to stay calm. She glanced at Mr. Lancaster, whose face had gone pale. He was old, frail, and whatever was happening now, whoever was coming, they weren't here for him. They were here for her. She clutched the letter in her hand, her mind racing. If her mother had been running from someone, if she had been afraid for her life, then Maria was in danger now too. The past wasn't buried. It was still alive, still watching, still waiting. The study door creaked open. A man in a dark suit stepped in, his expression unreadable, his presence sharp and deliberate. He wasn't just another staff member. Maria could tell by the way he held himself, the way his eyes swept the room, like he already owned it. "Ms. Thompson," he said, his voice smooth but cold. Or should I say, "Ms. Lancaster." Maria's hands tightened into fists. "Who are you?" The man gave a small knowing smile. "That doesn't matter. What matters is that you stop asking questions." Maria's pulse pounded in her ears. The pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place too fast, too sharp. Someone had wanted her mother gone. Someone had made sure Eleanor Lancaster disappeared without a trace. And now, that same force was trying to erase Maria before she could uncover the truth. But she wasn't going to let that happen. She took a slow step forward. "What happened to my mother?" she asked. Her voice steady. The man's smile didn't waver. "She made a mistake," he said simply. "She didn't know when to walk away." Maria's stomach twisted, rage burning beneath her fear. "Did you kill her?" she whispered. For the first time, the man's expression flickered. Just for a second. It was enough. He didn't need to answer. Maria already knew. A sharp intake of breath came from behind her. Mr. Lancaster gripped the edge of his desk, his frail hands shaking. His daughter, his only child, had been taken from him, not by time, not by accident, but by people who had made sure she never came back. Maria's mind raced. If these people had erased Eleanor, they could do the same to her, but not this time. Maria's fingers curled around the pendant in her hand. The one thing that tied her to the mother she never knew. She felt its weight, its history, its silent promise. Eleanor had fought to protect her, had given up everything so Maria could live. She wasn't going to let that sacrifice be for nothing. She looked up at the man, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I'm not walking away," she said, her voice firm. "You can't erase me like you erased her." A long pause, then the man exhaled, shaking his head slightly, almost like he was amused. "You really are her daughter," he murmured. Stubborn to the end, he turned slightly, his hand reaching into his coat. Maria tensed, ready to run, ready for anything. But then, another sound filled the room. A siren, loud, piercing, getting closer. Maria's heart leaped. Mr. Lancaster, despite his age, had done something no one expected. He had pressed the silent alarm beneath his desk. The man in the suit stiffened, his jaw tightening. He knew he was out of time. "I'd be careful if I were you," he said, his voice low but sharp. "You might think you've won, but the truth isn't always kind. Some things are better left buried." Then, just like that, he turned and disappeared. Down the hallway, seconds later, security stormed in, followed by the police. Maria felt her knees weaken as she tried to catch her breath. It was over, or at least, this part of it was. In the days that followed, the truth finally surfaced. Eleanor Lancaster had been silenced because she had uncovered something within her father's empire. Something powerful. Men didn't want getting out. When she tried to escape, they had hunted her down, making sure she never spoke again. But what they hadn't counted on was her child surviving. Maria had been hidden in the foster system, her identity erased, her connection to the Lancaster name buried. But fate had brought her back, and now she was no longer just a housekeeper. She was an heir, a survivor, the last living Lancaster. As she stood on the grand balcony of the mansion she had once only cleaned, she felt the weight of everything that had come before her. She would never know her mother, never hear her voice, never see her smile. But she had something just as powerful. She had the truth, and she would never let it be silenced again.